Greetings, students, and anyone else that happens to be watching this video. 'Tis I, Mr. Shea, in my house, in fact, here with you on a glorious day with a cup of tea and turning point number 6, the election of 1980, which elects this man in the photograph here to the presidency, Ronald Reagan. So we're going to be looking at this today, so let's kick it. So what came before? What became of America before this moment? Good question, you. Good answer, me. Maybe. We'll see. So before Reagan comes into office, he is preceded by this man here, Jimmy Carter. So Jimmy Carter is president in the 1970s. And the 70s are not a great year when it comes to the United States economy. There's a lot that's going on, and we're going to talk a little bit about that right now, because it really does affect what Reagan does and Reagan's perspective on things. In the 70s, there is not a whole lot of economic growth. There's some downturn. Unemployment at one point gets up over 10%, which is high. And the United States and Americans are seeing a lot of the prosperity that they saw at the end of World War II into the 50s and 60s starting to slow down. And if you look at this image here on the left, this graph here, the economic growth really is going up and down for a time in the early 70s during Nixon's presidency. It's killing it, but then it really does begin to struggle. So not only is growth not great, there's a lot of inflation. And inflation does a lot of things. Behind me, right here, these are bills from Zimbabwe. When I was studying abroad, I got a bunch of bills. One of them on the very bottom is a $100 trillion bill. And really what inflation does is you see the price of goods increase, but the money that people are earning is not increasing. So you don't see wages keeping up with costs. And the problem with inflation then is if you are trying to pay for things, you aren't able to do that as easily. What this is an example of is hyperinflation. That's very much not what happened in the United States in the 70s or ever. But hyperinflation, essentially if a nation has bad economic policy and bad monetary policy, is to combat the rising prices of goods, they simply print more money. And that devalues the money over time. So in places like Zimbabwe or in Germany, pre or post World War I, you have money that essentially becomes worthless almost as soon as it gets printed. The United States didn't get that bad, but it was getting pretty bad. And inflation really is a piece of economic policy that presidents try to avoid. And Carter was not able to do that. Coupled with these two issues of unemployment, low growth, high inflation, you have a couple of gas crises. So there's some conflict in the Middle East in the early 70s and throughout the 70s, in fact. And conflict in areas where most of the oil production occurs resulted in a lack of oil, which resulted in a lack of gasoline for Americans. So with these oil crises, you had cars lining up for blocks and blocks. As you see in this photo here, Americans were limited in some cases to how much gasoline they could buy, which really does affect your daily life. I don't think any of you have ever gotten to the point, and you've never have, I don't think, I know. You've never had a point in your lives where, and my life as well, that we've been limited by gas. But that is a major factor in transportation and movement in the society that we live in. Not only is there conflict going on in the Middle East that is disrupting oil supplies, but in 1979 we have the Iranian hostage crisis. And what happens is there's a revolution in Iran where the government is overthrown and the government that's put into place is fiercely anti-American. And for some cases, they see America as a corrupting influence in the region, that morals are being disregarded for economic gain, and there is some legitimacy to the impact the United States has had around the world in changing people's perspectives and objectives. That said, the American embassy in Tehran is stormed by students, and the embassy workers are taken hostage, which Carter doesn't necessarily respond to as well as a lot of Americans would hope. He does have one mission that's intended to rescue the hostages. It ends in disaster, and American servicemen die in a helicopter crash. So his handling of this situation, the economic situations, really, in a lot of Americans' minds, is very poor. And not only is that going on domestically and internationally, but we're in the middle of the Cold War. In response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Carter decides to boycott the Olympic Games that are being hosted by the Soviets. And some see the reason for that, of that punishment for the actions of the Soviets, but also a lot of Americans are upset that Carter is politicizing sports. Not that sports are not politicized, but certainly a lot of people care about sports. They are a great source of pride, of accomplishment. And when Carter takes that away, for whatever reasons it is, the result is a lot of Americans very upset with him. So Carter goes into this election in 1980, not in great standing with a lot of people in America. They see him as not having a great plan for how to get out of these problems. They see him as, in some ways, embracing the problems that America has versus saying, well, what are our strengths? And this man comes along to challenge him for the presidency. This is Ronald Reagan. On the right, this is Reagan as a young man. He was a lifeguard. I don't know if any of you are lifeguards out there, but he was a lifeguard for 7 years. And the number he claimed was 77 people he saved. So he was a good lifeguard. I don't think there's any bad lifeguards out there. But Reagan was, in many ways, just a normal American who, early in his life, he got into acting. And in his acting career, he was in movies and television shows. During World War II, he joined the service and created training videos for pilots. And when he got out of the service, he continued acting. After his acting career, however, Reagan decided to get into politics. And not only was he acting, he was a spokesperson for General Electric. So he's a well-known public speaker, a well-known person on camera. And he felt comfortable on camera, which, remember, television isn't super old at this point. So there isn't necessarily a need for a lot of politicians to be that savvy when it comes to being on the screen. Reagan, however, had been practicing his whole life and ended up running for governor of California. He wins the governorship in California and starts to put into place policies that today would be, in many cases, regarded as conservative. He's a Republican. He initially started his career, his life, regarding himself as a Democrat. But he saw a lot of problems when it came to governance that Democrats had. And a lot of these ways of governments, ways that government worked, came from Franklin Roosevelt. So what were some of the things that Reagan was looking at? Number one, he was concerned about the economy. And generally in elections, the economy is one of the most important points that politicians will focus on because it affects everyone. Reagan put forward an idea which is called supply-side economics, and it's this image on the right of this chart image, that if you focus on businesses first, and if businesses are doing well, the belief in supply-side economics, also known as voodoo economics, trickle-down economics, is that as long as these businesses are doing well, then the benefits are going to trickle down to the rest of society. So if you look at this image here, businesses get tax breaks, and that was one of Reagan's big pitches, was he wanted to cut taxes. He thought businesses and Americans were being taxed too much. So if there was a cut in taxes, according to Reagan, then businesses would be doing better, which means they would produce more goods and hire more workers. And if there's more workers that are being hired by businesses that are doing well, there are going to be more workers, and they're then going to take the money that they get from being workers and buy more. So that's the theory that Reagan is very much basing his economic policy off of. On the left here is Keynesian economics, which is a different set of ideas around how an economy can do better. And that one more focuses on the people. It focuses on how do we get people into programs that get them job skills, that get them money in their pockets, that get them stable enough that they do buy products and services, and that will in turn lift up the economy as a whole. Because the more products that are being bought, then more businesses need employees so that they can create more goods to sell. So there are two very different ways of looking at the economy. There are benefits and downsides with each one of them, and we'll get into a bit of those later. But he also, as a candidate for president, looks at the issue of government spending. And one of Reagan's biggest appeals to American voters is his push to cut back on how much money the United States government is spending on programs. And he sees and claims that there's a lot of waste, that the United States government is engaged in. Billions and billions of dollars are being wasted every year on everything from people fraudulently claiming unemployment to programs that are just not managed well. So he very much campaigns to cut back on the amount of spending that the United States government is going to do. Another piece of his platform addresses women. So at this time, there's something known as the Equal Rights Amendment that is being proposed to be passed as a constitutional amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And the point of the Equal Rights Amendment is to say that you cannot treat men and women or you cannot treat people differently by gender. Now, that seems fairly straightforward. However, there was a lot of opposition, especially from a group of more conservative women that saw the Equal Rights Amendment as an attack on women themselves, that it discredits and diminishes the value of being a mother, of being a wife. And that there were potential concerns if there was no, in their minds, separation between the genders. So there was a lot of, in some cases, hysterical claims of, if we pass this, there won't be locker rooms that separate men and women, which is not true. But the very idea of what does it mean to be a woman and should we be putting that into the Constitution was up for debate. And Reagan and the Republican Party really did not stand on either side of it. But by the time he got into office, he was more against ERA, but he was very pro-woman. So he was trying to build in how, yes, I support women, but I don't necessarily support this amendment, which he saw as greatly flawed. The Equal Rights Amendment still, to this day, has not been passed. I believe one more state needs to pass it. However, constitutional amendments do expire, so who knows if this will ever get passed. And one of the final pieces that came into play during and before Reagan comes to office is the rise of what's known as the religious right. It's also known as the Christian right. And it brings together a group of mostly evangelical Christians that view the changing dynamics of the United States as against Christian values. So the religious right focuses on issues like homosexuality, of the belief that families should look a certain way. It looks at issues like abortion and politicizes them. So it really engages especially the evangelical Christians to become more political and to support candidates, specifically, in most every case, Republican candidates, that will further these moral issues in a political realm. And while that seems probably to you like, duh, that's what happens, this is not really a case that had happened before this. Up until the 1980 election, religion and religious groups really, not to say stayed out of politics, but the pressure was not as overt. It wasn't as obvious as it did become in Reagan's campaign. And some estimates place it at 2/3 of the votes that Reagan got came in almost directly from the efforts of religious right groups. So all of these factors at play come in to a head in the election, and Reagan has a landslide victory across the United States. He wins in heavily Republican areas. He wins in heavily Democratic areas. South Boston votes for Reagan by 53%. South Boston never votes for Republicans. So it shows a lot about how Americans were feeling. A lot of them really were tired of this big government, this huge apparatus that had been a big government really for the last 50 years. They were hoping for less government out there, give the states some more control. There's some frustration with the economy. There's frustration with how the Cold War is going. And there's a lot of frustration with just how Carter saw America. He saw it as struggling. And Reagan saw it not as struggling, as a great place. He saw it as the greatest country in the world. And not that Carter didn't, but Carter didn't get that message across very well. And Reagan was an incredible communicator, which is why he's generally regarded as the great communicator. So what then comes out of the election of 1980? Well, number one, it really signals a shift for Republicans to have a platform that they can get on board with. It really brings about the rise of modern conservatives. Up to that point, Republicans really didn't know where they were going. After the Great Depression and the success of the New Deal and the popularity of Democratic presidents, the Republican Party was kind of fractured. They didn't really know where they were going. And Reagan provided them of, wow, this is the person that we should look to. This is an overwhelming victory. Clearly, his messages are well received and should continue to be promoted. So if you look at here, after Reagan, he has 8 years of his presidency. George Bush then comes in as the next president, as another Republican. Bill Clinton is a Democrat. However, the next George Bush. So with Reagan to Trump, there's only been 2 Democrats since then, Clinton and Obama. So it has also brought about a great deal of power for the Republican Party. Up until this point, a lot of the 20th century had been Democratic power. So number one, we have a shift in the political dynamics of the United States. Number two, we do also see a great deal of growth. The impact of Reagan coming into office, he cuts taxes, he deregulates the economy, and we'll get into that in a second. But there is a deal of prosperity that was not necessarily being seen during Carter, which wasn't necessarily Carter's fault. A lot of that came from policies that Nixon put into place. But sadly, for Carter at least, the problems occurred during his presidency. So the United States does see some good economic growth after the election of Reagan. And you can see there are some downturns and things during his presidency, but pretty quickly, the things are going up after he is elected. This results in a whole giant amount of wealth. So really since 1980, Americans have become very rich. And I'll say that as a qualifier, though. A small amount of Americans have become very rich. So if you look at this graph, the top 0.1% of Americans have seen their incomes grow over 400% since 1980. Whereas if you look at the rest of America, per capita GDP, just as a whole, has risen barely under 100%. In some cases, for the lower and the middle and lower class, have seen growth less than that. So what we start seeing after Reagan's presidency is a huge growth in wealth and a huge growth in wealth division, which, when you deregulate businesses and allow businesses to really thrive, which is the whole point of supply side economics, it's really no surprise that that's what happens. Interesting enough, while Reagan did slow down the growth of government, one of his tactics to really pressure the Soviet Union in the Cold War was spending. So, in fact, after 1980, government spending increased, which is kind of ironic. Or sorry, this is actually the debt. So debt increased, which also makes no surprise. So he cut taxes, so there's less money going into the government. And in some cases, he increased spending, especially with the military. And that then increased the debt of the United States. However, one of the big impacts of that debt spending was the end of the Cold War. Reagan realized that the Soviet Union was not as strong as perhaps people thought they were. So what he thought that the United States could do, which worked out tremendously well, was simply spend more money than them. It was an arms race. So Reagan put into place a couple of programs, like the Star Wars program, which was putting satellites into space that would shoot down rockets. And it was in some cases it didn't work, but the programs that he put into place forced the Soviet Union to try to keep up. And what happened is they couldn't. So the Soviet Union, this photo is across from my classroom. So students, you've probably walked past this a couple hundred times. But as the Soviet Union is trying to spend to keep up with the United States, the people of the Soviet republics are just tired of being in that society. They're tired of a lack of freedom. They're tired of economies that are not doing well. And they start rising up and overthrowing the communist governments. So in fact, in some ways, the Cold War is won by the people themselves in those countries that were fighting against communism. But Reagan very much did assist the end of it and presides over the fall of the Soviet Union. So by spending, in fact, he outspends the Soviets. And really the last thing I'll leave you with for today is this concept of deregulation. And as I mentioned, when he gets into office, he's concerned about large government. He's concerned that there's too big of a government that's stifling innovation, that's stifling Americans. And he wants them to really have more freedoms to explore and companies to try new things and make more money. And the effects of deregulation are vast. We will look at some of them as we continue with this year, my students, especially with banking deregulation. And one of the major impacts of deregulating the banks ends up being the 2008-2009 financial crisis, where banks were not as supervised as perhaps they might have been, and they got into some trouble in themselves, which ended up affecting a broad swath of the Americans and in fact the entire planet. We'll look at some environmental deregulation, some consequences of that. Energy deregulation. So this idea of deregulation is one of the strongest ones that comes out of Reagan's presidency. And in some cases does foster that competition. That's great that we want to see that promotes growth. And in other cases leads to greed. And that's where I will leave you now. So Reagan's presidency, election in 1980, huge changing point, really sets us to where we are right now when it comes politically, especially with conservatives. Especially with the Republican Party. And we will be looking at a bit more of that as we move forward. So thanks for watching, drink some tea, and we will catch y'all on the flip side. Until then.